Welcome to Praise Hands, home of the Praise Hands, where we are all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. I'm your host, Robbie Valderrama. From shortages of necessary equipment to inadequate staffing levels, COVID-19 is exposing the cracks in a healthcare system that many of us take for granted. On today's show, we continued our conversation with healthcare insider and my friend, Ben Walker, tackling tough questions about Christianity, government, and healthcare in light of historical trends and the crisis at hand. Let's jump on in. So Ben, you've spent a lot of time assessing the needs of the healthcare system. You work in the electrical engineer energy side of things. It's enabled you to have a bird's eye view of the healthcare system. What can you tell us about this system, maybe all the way from the government level down to how it affects an individual?
Sure. So that's a great question. To start, I think it's best to look at where the recent Relief Act that was signed by Trump administration, right? So we hear this
CARES.
Yeah, CARES. We hear this $2 trillion number, and it's hard to put that in context sometimes. There's some useful walking around numbers, right? So in the first case, we just spent $2 trillion on this bill. The US debt is about 20 trillion. Similarly, our GDP is about 20 trillion. The US budget is about 4 trillion. So it puts these numbers in context to say, we just spent half of our budget in trying to address this pandemic, half of our annual budget. And also, US spends roughly $4 trillion a year on healthcare, which is about double on a per person, per capita, per GDP, whatever measure you choose. It's about double what countries similarly sized would pay, and yet we're getting worse returns, a lower life expectancy, lower quality. So there's a lot of questions and active conversation around political debates, the campaign trail. If you follow the Democratic debates and primaries, it's been Medicare for all and those kinds of conversations. Affordable Care Act has been in our lexicon for a number of years now, all trying to drive down the costs of healthcare. So when we look at why costs in the US are higher, different people will point the fingers in different directions. There tends to be four main ways that people will point at. The first is hospitals. The second is the health providers, the salary of doctors. The third is insurance companies. And then the fourth is the price of drugs. It's not any one of those, but it's kind of all of those at once, right? It's this combination.
Right.
In hospitals specifically, a third of hospitals make money just fine. They're solvent. A third are struggling, and then the other third are in the red. That's this reality that we deal with. So in our role as consultants with our clients, they can have vastly different goals depending on where they are on that spectrum. Part of the challenges that they're facing, the hospital down the street might put in a new surgical system or a new surgery wing and take a lot of those services out from under the hospital in question. And those were lucrative. And now the hospital is trying to figure out how they can get income to come in or reduce expenses to make up that gap. So that's an interesting challenge that hospitals are facing. The other thing of interest in the healthcare economic side, we have one client that's maybe 25 hospitals around the southern US. And their operating margin was around 2%, right? In providing healthcare, hiring doctors, having patients come in, they made about 2%. On the treasury side, they made that much or more with just about 6 people, right? So these guys are taking the cash flow and figuring out how to invest it. And the fact that that's where so much of a healthcare system's income comes from is kind of crazy because it's outside of what you'd expect. In addition to the hospitals, doctors are paid about 2 to 4 times what they would be in other countries. If you look at the US, wages have risen, and the only two things that have risen faster than wages are education and medical expenses. Fungible goods like TVs, cars, all those are dropping. Software, food is roughly the same. Rent, housing is roughly the same. It's going to change depending on where you are in the country. But education and medical care just keeps growing and growing and growing. And they're actually tied in some ways, because as the doctors take out huge loans, they need to get the salary to pay that back.
Mm-hmm.
So there's maybe some bloat there. There's definitely some bloat in the insurance companies. As we look at how the insurance companies are incentivized, Blue Cross Blue Shield, health insurance that everyone's familiar with, they began as a not-for-profit with the idea of essentially allowing people to stay for 21 days in a hospital, provided that they paid into some, 50 cents a month back in the 1900s. That not-for-profit, the money they took in, about 95 cents of every dollar went back to providing health. Over the years, that number dropped and dropped. And it was in the early 90s that it was all the way down to about 80 cents a dollar, and even as low as 60 cents in some states, as more and more bloat administrative work just was added into the system. And Blue Cross Blue Shield finally said, okay, we have to change our methods to catch up with everybody else and be a for-profit institution. And they predominantly did that to try to access the capital in stock markets and those kinds of things. But the Affordable Care Act came in and said, time out, let's make sure that there's a requirement that you spend at least 85 cents of every dollar on healthcare services. The perverse incentive there is the insurance companies looked at that, shrugged, and said, okay, we'll just pay more for everything else so that our salaries grow with that, right? So you get these stories of, oh yeah, sure, that medicine was $30,000 a year and now it's $100,000 a year because the insurance doesn't care. They need, they're incentivized at the top. The CEOs are incentivized to track their own salary and their own numbers. So that's, just an interesting challenge. And then the fourth that we've talked about would be the price of drugs. So Medicare, Medicaid, the US government is prevented from negotiating the cost of drugs on their own. Congress prevents that capability. House passed the bill in December last year, December 2019. The House bill passed, said, okay, Medicaid, Medicare, you can negotiate drug prices. The Senate refuses to take it up. So it's a weird partisan issue that seems like it shouldn't be. Just we can name other things that fit that realm, but the ability to negotiate drug prices would help us drop that down as well. So we've kind of got these four: hospitals, doctors, insurance, and drugs, that all feed into why healthcare costs are so high in this country.
Yeah, that's fascinating. In the Christian community, there's a lot of folks that do medical sharing. That's what our family does, and it's not technically insurance. I think the costs are maybe about 20% to 25% of what the same amount of like deductibles and coverage that you'd have. The main difference is it's not technically insurance. If the system went belly up, you just need to know that that could happen. And so to me, that says there's like a lot of extra money somewhere in this insurance side of it.
Yes. So the other challenge is if you're going in with a group to say, we're all going to pool our money, your incentive is now to reduce the amount of care you would need, right? That you want to reduce the amount of out. That's not the incentive that insurance companies have.
Right.
Their incentive is to not pay at all. The doctors, their incentive isn't to treat you and minimize your health outcomes. It's actually what's the most expensive surgery or treatment that we can recommend and provide. So I think there's going to be a push. It started in some circles for preventative care, and there's a huge opportunity in the US for that, but there's not a ton of money available for investors. And so I think the market,
because it's not as profitable.
Exactly. They just look at that a little skeptically right now.
Is there any system that you see working that reduces that conflict of interest that is traditionally known for doctors and patients?
Adding not-for-profit is a great way to do that. To see more insurance companies go that direction. We talked about Blue Cross Blue Shield. The goal of insurance originally really was to help people kind of survive the sickness and get back to health.
Right.
And when the goal is to profit off of those sick people, it's a slight, subtle, fundamental shift. So we could look for more not-for-profit institutions to step in and take that up. Another opportunity really would be for government to do that. And so there is this single payer option, or the kind of government run, depending on which side of the aisle you would use a different name. But the concept is there's so many insurance providers. There's a lot of administrative work on healthcare professionals, on hospitals in billing it appropriately. And there's a lot of uncertainty and confusion in that, right? You'll get a hospital bill and you can call up the hospital and say, why did I get charged XYZ? And oh, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We can't tell you why. And okay, give me an itemized list. And oh, guess what? Your bill was dropped by 20%. So these anecdotes show that there is that bloat that we could cut out. One way to do that would be through nationalizing the healthcare. I know that plenty resist that idea, but that is one approach to trying to cut out some of that excess fat.
Now, Ben, last week when you were on the show with Ian Patterson and we chatted through a whole host of issues, innovation and regulation in times of crisis. And one of the things that I shared was being a part of the relief efforts in North Nashville after the recent tornado. We talked through some of the pros and cons of kind of a free-for-all decentralized effort, as well as the need for some elements of centralization. In light of your experience in the healthcare industry, interfacing with the government as well as local organizations, can you go even maybe a little deeper than we went last episode on this tension from your perspective?
So one of the fascinating things about an event like the tornadoes in Nashville is you can have this centralized response where one large group comes in and just goes row by row, house by house, we're going to fix everything. Or you can have the decentralized that's much, much faster, where we're going to get in and solve the biggest problems as you go. My concern with the decentralized approach is that someone will get forgotten. And if you've overlooked the house on the corner behind the tree with the elderly neighbor who you can't come out and advocate for themselves, you've done a disservice. The speed is great, but making sure we can cover those in need is one of the biggest challenges for healthcare, the biggest challenges for our country right now facing COVID-19. That's why I advocate for a system that was careful in taking the time to go step by step, address by address, and addressing each issue. And as we do that, we recognize that there are people in our society who are often overlooked. It's not just healthcare. I mean, churches see this all the time, right? We're trying to serve the least of these, right? We're trying to serve the forgotten. I mean, Jesus goes and has dinner with the prostitutes, right? He goes to kind of the outcasts of society. Mm-hmm. And that's a specific choice that Christ made in an attempt to draw them in. We can use healthcare and public policy design choices to do the same thing to try to draw people in. I was at a church in Evanston, Illinois for a few years, a couple dozen people, and grew to about 40 and then came back down and eventually decided to close because the numbers didn't support us. But throughout that process, maybe 6 years, we had these conversations of there's value to our church being here, specifically because there's people who live right across the street who can't walk very far, and they don't have anywhere else to go. And so the interesting challenge that hospitals face, we said, a third are facing bankruptcy with their challenging cash flows. If those hospitals close, these people have nowhere to go. If certain churches close, these people have nowhere to go. And I would advocate for accepting that challenge and funding either those hospitals or those churches from other areas. In healthcare, it's the rich hospital who's in the urban city who does all the plastic surgery and knee replacements and all that. They should be, the word is taxed. They should be taxed, and that money should be sent to the rural hospital because that rural hospital has value and they have to have the staff and the equipment to serve their population. And yet they don't necessarily have the income to support that. And you see parallels in the church world that are pretty apparent.
Right. One of the questions that we tackle a lot is this intersection of church and economics, and particularly how is the best way for the church to allocate its resources. There's kind of two main approaches. One is again, centralized, like the diocese-based model, where, we've got a diocese and then we've got parishes, the Roman Catholic model, where it's geographical, but also centralized in terms of a lot of the control. Then you've got more of the free church model or, Pentecostal or, church plan, hey, a pop-up shop model of church. And again, you see that same sort of contrast between centralized and decentralized. And it's a really interesting parallel that you've drawn between the healthcare and the church. The advantage of the centralized model is, like you said, every territory is covered. The advantage of the decentralized model is it may be more adaptable towards unique situations where assets can flow in really quickly because they see a need. I'm wondering if this sort of thing may be a tension that we kind of have to walk out and figure out some sort of way to navigate. One interesting thing, this is something maybe I'll have to do a whole episode on sometime, is the connection between the church's responsibility to pastor and the church's responsibility to provide medical care. I read a fascinating book by a guy named R.J. Rushdoony. It talked about the priestly calling of doctors. And some of the things that I learned from that book was that the word salvation, like salve, is very much related to sozo, which is like to heal. Like that's the same sort of Greek word. And even like doctrine is related to the same word as doctors. Like the early church doctors were the keepers of doctrine. And so in the early church, what salvation meant to a lot of people was actually restoration to a community through healing. It's very interesting when you look at the church state healthcare amalgamation and universe of things. And I'm actually curious, for you living in Utah, where that is maybe one of the closest places in the US that we have to kind of a church state, very close knit. I think it's like 70 or 80% of the registered elected officials in Utah are LDS, are in the Mormon church. And I'm curious if you have any perspective on that church state dynamic from being in Utah.
Yeah. So I moved to Utah about 2 years ago, and we moved to Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City became majority non-Mormon right as we were arriving. There is a strong sense of Mormon and not Mormon. You kind of embrace one of the two. I happen to coach high school sports at a Catholic high school. And so, we'll engage with them a little bit, but the high school sports tournaments are Friday, Saturday, because no Mormons want to play on Sunday. There's a nationally ranked college team that they keep making, the tournaments, and they can never go because they refuse to play on Sundays. And so there's kind of an active conversation around what that looks like in the day-to-day and how you do your week and what businesses are closed on and open. In terms of how the politics happen on the Hill, there are a lot of LDS elected officials. In some ways, it's a part of their identity in the way that Christianity is. But in some ways, it's, you need to at least check that box for people to vote for you. And so there can be some tension between things maybe like abortion or homosexuality or things that are active in all churches, not just Mormon churches. And there are some concerns that I would have where I differ from the LDS church in what the state government chooses to do. And so I think some of the challenges in Utah maybe do stem from that slow transition, where I'm at, urban 50-50, there's kind of an obvious mix. Whereas you go rural, it does start becoming significantly Mormon. My wife grew up in some of those rural areas, northern Utah, and a lot of her friends were just not Mormon. Like that was what they had in common. She went to a Baptist church, and a lot of her friends just didn't go to any church because there's nothing connecting them except that, 80% of the population at school already knew each other and go to their ward and do that stuff. So there is some uniqueness to the Utah situation.
Yeah, there's a school of thought. I think it's called, some people call it different things like Dominionism or triumphalism, where in terms of the church's role in society, people, which R.J. Rushdoony is one of the main intellectual proponents of that, would say that it's the church's job to actually take those positions of leadership in government, take those in all the different spheres of society in kind of a, for lack of a better term, in a dominionist way. And I think it's interesting to see kind of in this centralization versus decentralized conversation, for something like the Mormons, where there's definitely efficiency, where they can say, hey, this is how it's going to be, and you're going to vote this way. Thank you very much. We also look and see Europe several centuries ago, where you had a church-state really close relationship. And even as recently as Hitler's times, where you had some of the church in Germany played the part of, okay, well, it's always kind of been church and state. We kind of have to go with the flow, even though Hitler's doing the stuff that we're not quite comfortable with. And then you had others going into Switzerland, the Karl Barths and the different people that were saying, hey, we don't feel comfortable playing along with whatever the government is going to do. And even before that, you had Calvin and Luther and the Anabaptists were there, all these tensions. It's a really interesting conversation to have about centralization of power and the pros and cons that come with that.
Well, and one of the interesting things too is, as you pointed out earlier, health has been historically tied to faith institutions. And a lot of the hospitals we work with, they claim some tradition. They'll even have that in their name. You might see, Adventist or something like that, right? I've gone into hospital executive rooms, and as you come off the elevators, they open and there's a Bible verse in front of you, right? And you don't expect that in too many places in the U.S., and yet you do still see that at times in these different healthcare systems. I wish there was more to draw from that, aside from there is still that mission of service. Even while maybe we point fingers and say, you could save money here and you should do it better over there. The people who are doing the work often do come from a service perspective, which I really admire. It's just a different feeling when you can work with someone who, we're here for people, and that sometimes gets lost when you talk about, okay, at the very, very top of organizations, whether it's insurance or hospitals, what have you, that gets lost sometimes up there. But when you get down in the trenches, sometimes that's when it's like, no, we're doing this as a people together. And I think that's what you see with the COVID-19 response. The healthcare workers who are on the front lines are fighting on behalf of everybody.
Right.
And there's a solidarity to that that's inspiring.
Right. No, absolutely. One of the premier scholars of early Christianity's growth is a social scientist / historian named Rodney Stark, and he's out of Baylor University. And he made the interesting observation when there was a couple plagues that hit Rome, all of the pagan priests actually fled the city. It was the Christian non-priests that were just like, well, we're just going to care for people. And he actually attributes those as two of the main events that actually led to the rapid rise of Christianity, is because you had the people that they didn't need much. They just needed somebody to provide them water and some basic stuff. They were able to survive, and they said, well, I guess we're some of these Christian people now because they're the ones that stuck around for us. And so it's very interesting when you see that legacy going that far back.
Actions speak, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think on the topic of economics with all of this, one of the interesting questions to ask about any sort of system, whether it's a church system or whether it's the medical system, is who primarily is the system designed to benefit?
Yes.
And I think that is really telling. And that's one of the reasons why I struggle and have a hard time with the concept of limited liability. I can understand how it enables things to scale more quickly. But at the same time, when people are unwilling to take responsibility for things at that level, you also have some unintended consequences that come with that. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. One of the things we haven't talked about is how the ethos of the US and the societal gestalt of who we are plays into these decisions. So we tend to be a bit litigious as a society. What happens with that? Doctors will overprescribe because they want to protect themselves. We tend to be a bit individualistic. What happens with that? We don't really want to stay inside when you tell us we should or we have to for social distancing. So when we look at responses to COVID around the world, part of the intrigue to me is how a country like South Korea or China was able to use societal buy-in to stomp down very, very quickly. Now, one's more of a forced situation and one's more of a democratic situation. But in both, there was this culture of we are working for the whole. And I think that's pretty different from the US, and it shows in our response to this pandemic.
Right. And I wonder how much of that individualism is related to the mistrust that Americans have to the corporate political complex. It's obviously deeper rooted than that, but I think it may play in as well.
There's certain mistrust in how certain aspects have been rolled out. The fact that we as a country at the higher White House level denied it for a few weeks before, okay, yes, now we will embrace action. That was a little disappointing. The US government is uniquely situated to respond in a few ways that no one else really is. the governments of all countries are the ones stepping in to say, we will provide checks to the people who are unemployed. We will provide insurance or rent help, or we will force companies to now make ventilators. Or there's some voluntary action, and there's wonderful stories of small businesses trying to stay open and people, ordering more takeout or something like that to encourage that. But in the end, this really is a fundamental problem for the governments to solve when unemployment could rise as high as 30%, which is greater than what we saw in the Great Depression. We're just not really set up to do that. And my biggest concern about the economy is not how we will respond in 2 weeks. It's how we're going to respond in the next 4 to 8 months, right? Can we get back on track to say, yep, everything's close to back to normal. We're able to get these businesses back up and running, or are we going to be in a position where the infrastructure and the market realities that were allowing businesses to operate have just disappeared?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you can try to get the band back together, but there's no opportunity to do that.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting questions that I think also comes with the corporate bailouts or the CARES Act or different government money that's coming to the people or to corporations is how that is in practice actually going to get to people. And that's one of the things that people are saying with the CARES Act is like, hey, if you're expecting a check like next Friday, you might want to make some other plans.
To me, the challenge isn't just in the actual practical application of doling it out. It's frustrating and it's difficult, but it should be solvable. The other thing is, are we giving the help in the way that it needs to be given? So $1,200 to somebody in Alabama is very different to $1,200 given to somebody in Seattle. So I would love to see something a bit more aggressive, something that said, we're going to freeze rent, mortgage payments. And there are landlords, they struggle on that. But the reason that they often struggle is because they need to turn around and pay a mortgage, right? And so if we just freeze all components so that, okay, what can we freeze so that it's the banks bearing the brunt of this? Well, the banks have the ability to borrow capital and they can kind of withstand the transition just lasting a little bit longer. So the rollout of how we do this, I think we're probably giving too much money to large corporations. We're giving more to them than we are to individuals. But the practicality is less interesting to me than, are we actually addressing the needs as they arise? I'm nervous that we're not, and that there are going to be people who not only lose their houses, but I think, as Ian said earlier, suicide is rising. And so there's some challenges to the way that help comes, the timing, the practicality, the amount, all those things.
Right. I think that's one of the questions that I have is, in scenarios like this, how do we make sure that money goes to the people that need it the most and also doesn't further inequality even further? And if I look at something like the New Deal, a lot of people may forget that that was right as redlining was starting. And it was the FHA that was created through the New Deal that created all this redlining, which created so much inequality. And I almost see a parallel where you see all this money being doled out. Yeah, a lot of it's going towards corporations. How much of that is actually going to go back to people? And if so much of it is going towards corporations, is that substantially going to fix anything if the inequality is so great that some of these systemic issues keep perpetuating themselves?
I'm confident you could find an economist to say yes or no, depending on which side of the battle they came from. So it's a fair debate. In my realm of electricity, people throw around the word justice a lot. So there's social justice, where variety of things. One term that we use is energy justice. And the idea is, okay, we want solar panels, great. Let's incentivize people to buy solar. I know we'll have homeowners. If you are a homeowner, you can buy solar and you'll save money. Well, that's a fine perspective, but the only people who can buy solar panels are those who own homes.
Right.
And so you have this rich get richer, and who's left? Well, now the poor have to subsidize that panel that's being put on the roof. Now, I'm very pro-solar, and I think you can do it in good ways, but if you're not careful about how you roll out a program, you're going to trot on people accidentally.
Right.
There was an article that was shared around my company just yesterday about civil rights leaders are objecting to utilities stepping down natural gas because natural gas is a very cheap fuel and they want cheap energy prices. And my point is, I'm all for that. We mentioned the solar rollout challenge. If we get energy prices to be low by running a pipeline through an Indian reservation, we're not solving the problem, we're just shifting it around, right? And so taking that systemic kind of whole bird's eye look is the important approach to solve the issue. I've got a question for you, Robbie.
Yes, please.
In the COVID-19 reality that we're in, what gives you hope?
Well, I actually don't have a whole lot of hope in the government with this. That's to show my cards a little bit. Part of why I am concerned with that is when you look at different societies throughout history as their debt level increased and as both the entitlements for the wealthy as well as the need to subsidize the lower quadrant of society increased, it became unsustainable for those societies to continue. I think that there are certainly ways that you can, remedy that. But if you look, we are at, 16, $20 trillion in debt compared to our GDP. That's a tough mountain to climb, especially if we're not maybe innovating at the same rate as China or some of these other players. It's a tough mountain to climb. That doesn't particularly give me hope. I'm not abandoning any possibility of improvement. What gets me really hopeful is seeing the relationships that come out of these times. Seeing parents parent their kids together when people are at home. Some parents have never had to parent their kids together in the history of their marriages. Some parents are really struggling, and people are talking about divorce rates going up and stuff like that. But so many people are like, that I talk to are like, we just don't want it to go back. I'm seeing people realize, wow, a very high percentage of my time was going towards other people's agendas.
Yeah.
And I haven't been around for my family. My goal in life has been something completely different than maybe what it should have been. So I'm hopeful for some of these. Obviously, it's not an incident anybody wanted to happen, but I'm hopeful to see the perspective shift that's coming from a very big crisis moment. Hopeful that it'll force some positive changes moving forward. Theologically, I'm hopeful because I believe what Martin Luther King Jr. said, that the moral arc of the universe is long and just. And if I look at these different crises, how people rebound and the creativity that comes from it, there's this concept biblically called imago Dei, where we're made in the image of God. God was able to speak and this world was made. And I think we also are endowed with that creative capacity. That is such a gift to be able to be used for the benefit of others. And when we go through hard times, we're forced to be creative. If you look at the Black church over the last 400 years in America, they have had to come up with certain solutions for, urban food banks and urban gardens and resource sharing and business directories in their church just to survive. And I feel like a lot of the rest of the church now is saying, oh, what have you guys been doing the last 400 years? Can we take some notes from you? Even the Bible talks about if we're going to suffer with Christ, we're going to reign with him. And I feel like as we are able to not run from the pain in the world, but run to it, that actually equips us with the creativity we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. And when we're not afraid to suffer and to sacrifice as Jesus did, to me, that's where I place my hope, is not in the inherent perfection of man and that we're always going to make the right decision. There's obviously a lot of people not making good decisions right now in this scenario as well. I tend to have a positive outlook. There's a biblical parable about the wheat and the tares, I think is what it's called. And it's basically, as evil is increasing in the world, also light increases. And I think that we're going to see, some dark times in the world. You look at environmentally kind of what's going on and different things. Like there's some trends that are not heading in the right direction. But I think amidst those, there's still hope. And ultimately, for me, that rests in the Word of God and the promises that he makes. Whether you take the approach of that's real or whether that's just something that inspires people, I tend to take the first approach. But regardless, that is something that people can hold on to, that I believe is going to continue the seeds of these things that we can plant that will turn into intergenerational blessing. Like if you look after Christianity has come places, even in post-Christian societies, what is the fruit of those? You see hospitals, you see schools, you see some of these things. Now, Christianity hasn't had a perfect track record, but in terms of the legacy of what it's left behind, I think you can see good fruit in a lot of cases. Maybe not if you zoom in too small in certain instances, but certainly over centuries, the world's moved forward.
Thank you. As we talk about what the fruit is of kind of post-Christian societies, the story that has been emphasized to me repeatedly throughout Christ's life is that Christianity is primarily about compassion.
Mm-hmm.
What concerns me when I see certain politicians claim Christianity but reject compassion, that seems unresolvable in my mind. And I think that in some ways our society, whether you want to talk about healthcare, whether you want to talk about income inequality, whether you want to talk about incarceration rates or pick your topic, we're moving compassion further and further down the list of priorities and moving safety, protection, money up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I'm hoping
mm-hmm.
we can use this crisis to reevaluate that
mm-hmm.
and to examine not only ourselves, but our societal priorities,
right,
and ask, is this the best way?
Right. Yeah, I think when you look at the life of Jesus, when he did miracles, a couple times it says, and he saw them and he had compassion on them, and then he did the miracle. In order for the miracle to happen, in order for us to engage with the problems of the world, there has to be that compassion. But in order for there to be that compassion, you have to see people. And I heard somebody say recently that you can't love something that you haven't first observed. One of the interesting things with this COVID situation is neighbors are actually talking to each other. And people are saying, oh, how are you actually doing? I'm observing your situation for the first time ever. And do you need anything? And when we are so atomized and isolated, ironically, there's another paradox of this isolation of one type is creating new types of community in other ways. And when we are able to gain proximity to people and see the need, I think that's the first step before compassion and before seeing miracles unfold around us in this world.
We're on our way.
We're on our way. Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed it. Really appreciate the perspective that you bring. Yeah, best wishes to you and Elise and your dog and all that you're doing in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in, friends. First of all, I want to say a huge thank you to those of you who have made a donation to support our Praise Hands team during this time. Several members on our team have lost one or multiple jobs during this time, and some of my favorite moments of the past few weeks have been seeing these team members blessed by your generosity. If you'd like to make a donation to support our team members during this time, visit praisehands.com/donate. For the time being, 100% of dollars donated to our 501c3 will go directly towards honoring the work these team members are doing for Praise Hands and helping support them during this time. If you or your organization have been affected by COVID-19, visit praisehands.com/COVID-19 for a list of resources, ideas, and solutions we've compiled that might be useful to you. And lastly, if you're stuck in your house and want to do something productive, visit praisehands.com/volunteer to join one of our growing teams. As you invest your spare hours into creative cross-cultural Christianity, you'll connect with a community of like-minded individuals, which is so important in this time of potential isolation. Thanks for your support, folks. We'll see you next week.